On October 30th, 1928, an employee walked down the steps of the Lake Bluff City Hall furnace room. Upon opening the door, he was met with an absolutely horrific scene. There was a woman on the floor without clothing, with burns so severe that they were down to the bone in some places. When asked what happened to her and who had done it, the woman would go on to whisper something that sounded completely impossible. This was so much so that it's still baffling almost 100 years later. This is the story of the Lake Bluff Furnace Girl, and although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. It was just after 7:30 in the morning on October 30th, 1928, when Chris Lewis made his way down the basement stairs of City Hall in Lake Bluff, Illinois. As a city employee, it wasn't part of his normal job to light the building's furnace, but Police Chief Barney Rosenhagen had requested he do so, and Chris wasn't about to argue with authority. He then walked to the bottom of the stairs, unlocked the furnace room door, and went to step inside when he froze at what he saw. There, illuminated by the soft flicker of the open and lit furnace, was the figure of a young woman who was without clothing, but that's not all. Her skin was blackened and blistered, and she was standing shakily in front of the furnace. Her hands, feet, and face were completely charred, and for a moment neither Chris nor the woman moved. They just stared at each other for a second. Then she finally spoke, muttering the word "water" before collapsing to the ground. Chris then immediately yelled for help, and his panicked voice echoed up the basement stairs. Barney heard his cries and then came running, and when he arrived at the furnace room, he saw exactly what had Chris so spooked. The two men then did what they could to help the woman, who was rushed to Lake Forest Hospital, but the damage was catastrophic. She had severe burns on both her feet, her right leg, both forearms, and the front of her head. In some areas, this was down to the bone. Her face was also swollen and scorched beyond recognition, but miraculously, she was still alive. Somehow, she'd even managed to talk, although most of the words came out as garbled phrases and contradictions that would only confuse how she ended up this way. As she received desperately needed medical attention, authorities identified her as Elfrida Knack, a 29-year-old from Deerfield, about 15 miles south of Lake Bluff, but that was just the beginning. What Elfrida would say in the days that followed would involve everything from obsession to spiritual delusion, scandal, and pure suspicion. And nearly a century later, people are still asking the same thing Chris and Barney must have thought when they first laid eyes on her. And this question is, what on earth happened to the Lake Bluff Furnace Girl? Maybe most confusingly though, if we're to believe the story that Elfrida would tell investigators in the days after being discovered, she had somehow done this horrible act to herself. Before she became a tabloid headline though, Elfrida was just Fritzy. That's what her friends called her, and to them she was warm, caring, articulate, and driven. She was a woman of faith and purpose, and definitely not someone you'd expect to end up at the center of one of the most bizarre and gruesome mysteries in Illinois history. Born in the late 1890s and raised with strong moral and spiritual values, Elfrida had all the makings of a model citizen. She had been a popular student at the University of Chicago, and after graduating she became a school teacher. Her students apparently adored her, and so did her fellow churchgoers. She was pretty, endearing, kind, and charming, all qualities that helped her become well known in her community. Eventually, she left full-time teaching, but never gave up guiding others. She stayed involved in her local church and regularly taught Sunday school. Outside of that, she had built a solid career as a book saleswoman for a Chicago publishing firm. And by all accounts, she was extremely successful in her field, and she never once portrayed herself as someone looking to end things, or someone who would wander naked into a basement furnace in the dead of night. This is a big part of what made the whole situation so unsettling. There were no warning signs, erratic behavior, or history of strange breakdowns or outbursts. Elfrida was grounded in the eyes of everyone who knew her. She was certainly religious, maybe even intensely so at times, but not in a way that was ever alarming until one day in late October 1928 when everything started unraveling. The story of how Elfrida ended up in the Lake Bluff City Hall furnace room began the previous afternoon. On October 29th, she left for Chicago and gave a special lecture to other salesmen at her publishing firm. She was wearing a stylish coat with a fur collar and bone buttons, and a hat with a little metal ornament on it. At some point during the day, she called her sister, cheerfully mentioning that she bought some new sheet music and expected to be home by 7:30 that night, but she wouldn't make it home after all. As it turned out, after leaving her publisher's office in Chicago around 6 p.m., Elfrida did begin heading home by boarding a train heading north. The next confirmed sighting of her came around 8 p.m. when she stepped off in Highland Park. This is when her plans hit a snag. She was trying to catch a bus to get home to Deerfield, but as fate would have it, the bus schedule had recently changed, and she would have to wait hours for the next ride. Most people might have accepted this and just hung around the bus station to wait, but Elfrida didn't. Instead, she checked her briefcase at the station and bought a round-trip train ticket to Lake Bluff. This quiet suburban village north of Highland Park wasn't exactly a prime destination to kill some time at, but when the train pulled into Lake Bluff Station around 9:40, Elfrida was on it and she got off. According to what she would later tell investigators, she went there to see a man named Charles W. Hitchcock. Charles was a 52-year-old night policeman in Lake Bluff. He was married for 18 years at the time, had 5 kids, and on the surface seemed like a stand-up guy. He was also a vaudeville movie actor, which was a type of popular theater at the time, and something of a small-town heartthrob. People even called him the village Adonis. Elfrida told authorities in the days after she was found in the furnace room that she was in love with Charles, even calling herself his spiritual sweetheart. She had apparently gone to Lake Bluff that night to see him, although whether he ever knew she was coming remains up for debate. Charles himself denied knowing anything about her romantic feelings towards him. He told police he had never dated her or led her on, and he couldn't imagine where she had gotten the idea that they were connected in that way. Still, as you might imagine, Elfrida's claims made Charles a person of great interest to the investigation into what happened to her. His alibi for that night, however, was about as rock solid as one could get. You see, at the time, Charles's leg was broken and his leg was in a cast and his movement was severely limited. Physicians later confirmed that while technically possible, it was highly unlikely he could have snuck out without his injuries giving him away. And weirdly, even Elfrida seemed to agree. When one investigator tried to provoke a reaction from her by saying they were arresting Charles for her injuries, she responded that such a thing would be a rank injustice. After that, unfortunately, the best lead investigators had at that point had to be completely ruled out. This is where things get murky, as there's a massive hole between her getting off the bus at 9:40 p.m. and being found by Chris the following morning around 7:30. It seems that Charles's leg injury must not have been known to Elfrida as she made her way to City Hall once she arrived in Lake Bluff. Since Charles was the town's night policeman, she likely expected him to be at City Hall, which is where the police station was located. Using a key she claimed to have possession of, she opened one of the back doors of the building and stepped inside. It's unknown if she spent time looking for Charles throughout the building, or if it became apparent early on in her wandering that Charles wasn't there, but at some point she found herself inside the furnace room. Once there, rather than leave and continue her trip back home, she decided to spend the night in the furnace room and sleep on the floor. She claimed she then awoke around dawn with the strange idea of causing those burns she would later be found with as a testament for her love for Charles. She also insisted this was some sort of spiritual act, but even as she spoke those words from her hospital bed, not everyone was buying it. It was just so beyond strange. In taking a closer look at the scene itself too, it didn't take investigators long to realize that Elfrida's story wasn't adding up. She claimed to have entered the back door of City Hall using a key, but no key was ever found among her belongings or in the ashes of the furnace itself. And speaking of her belongings, they were discovered about 10 feet from the furnace in a pile and included her purse, shoes, and wristwatch. They had each been laid out neatly, but the rest of her clothing was conspicuously missing from the pile. There was no coat, hat, or dress to be found, all of which she was seen wearing by multiple witnesses the night before. Detectives sifted through the ashes inside the furnace and turned up a few scraps, including some metal clasps from garters and tiny blackened fragments of what may have once been a girdle or a dress. That was it. But maybe the most confusing element of the scene was a set of fresh bloodstains inside the furnace room. Burns don't typically bleed, especially like the severe ones Elfrida suffered. And although everything she claimed still had to be taken with a grain of salt, Elfrida never mentioned injuring herself other than the burns themselves. This made the bloodstains hard to explain, and her story only got stranger as the hours and days passed since being discovered in the furnace room. At some point, she muttered a woman's name, claiming that this person knew who had done this to her, but the name came out garbled and no one in the room could make it out. Investigators were desperate for clarity, and in a last-ditch effort, they brought in Charles himself to speak to her. They hoped a face-to-face meeting might snap her into reality or expose the truth. When he arrived at the hospital with his broken leg still in its cast, he leaned over the bed and asked if Elfrida had done this terrible thing to herself. Weak and fading fast by this point, Elfrida replied that she hadn't. This sudden admission came as a shock to everyone. Elfrida had staunchly maintained that she had done this to herself, but now she was saying she didn't do it. And as her condition worsened, her moments of lucidity became fewer and further between. But just before she passed away on the 3rd day after she was found, she seemed to snap into sharp focus. This is apparently common in people who are terminally ill, where they'll have a brief moment of clarity. She then looked at her brother and a nurse who were in the room with her and forcefully stated, "I didn't do it, they did." Elfrida could offer no further context as to who they were, as these were her final words. Just like that, death finally took her. All taken together, police now had this woman who supposedly had terrible things done to her under the most suspicious circumstances imaginable, and simultaneously in her final moments directly denied the story she'd been telling all along. Police hoped that more answers would come with Elfrida's autopsy, and they did, but not in the way investigators might have been expecting. From the examination, the coroner determined that Elfrida had suffered a massive blow to the head at some point. Not only that, but her body showed signs of electrocution as veins had been ruptured in ways consistent with high voltage contact. Authorities also noted that a powerful electrical transformer was located just outside the City Hall building. If it was just one of these things she had suffered, this could still have been plausibly done by her, but with the combination, it made it seem much more like someone had hit her first to incapacitate her. So suddenly, Elfrida's injuries were looking more like the result of a cold-blooded attack. But, in truth, the real story might have been buried with her. In the weeks and months following Elfrida's death, the theories about what might have happened to her continued to bubble up as everyone from investigators to the general public struggled to make sense of the case. The most widely circulated explanation was that Elfrida had indeed done this to herself as some kind of strange sacred offering. She had talked about Charles like he was a divine figure and made vague references to cleansing her soul. Her brother even testified at the coroner's jury that she believed deeply in mind over matter and that she might have been trying to prove that the human spirit could overcome even physical agony. That theory, however, crumbles under the weight of the physical evidence. The injuries alone made it almost impossible, according to doctors. They said that in order for her to do what she claimed, she would have had to insert one foot into the furnace and leave it there for several minutes. Then she'd have to stand on that scorched foot while doing the same to the other. After that, she'd have to stand on two damaged legs, lean forward, and do the same with her arms and face. Doctors explained that the feeling from this would have been immediate and excruciating. Most people would likely have passed out long before getting that far. So that's where the second theory begins to take shape, which is the idea that Elfrida didn't do this to herself, but was instead a victim of someone else. According to this version of events, someone lured her to City Hall, attacked her, and used the furnace to try to destroy the evidence. And it's not hard to see how this story starts to stick. Her autopsy revealed burns, but also signs of a serious blow to the head and indications of possible electrocution. Her brain also showed trauma, and her clothes were mostly missing as her hat and coat were never found. And finally were her final words, spoken with eerie clarity. Elfrida stated that she didn't do it, and instead they were responsible, like there was more than one person involved. Then add in the blood, the locked doors, the back and forth confusion over whether she had a key, and it's not hard to believe that she might have been attacked. But even if this was the case, who was responsible? The most likely suspect was Charles, and if he was involved in some kind of romantic relationship with Elfrida, getting rid of her could have meant saving his marriage if his wife was to ever find out about possible transgressions, but at the same time his broken leg gave him a solid alibi. For a brief moment as well, investigators entertained the idea that Barney, the police chief, was the suspect. After all, he was the last to leave City Hall the night before and first to arrive the next morning, so he had an opportunity. According to the investigation though, he had an alibi of his own that was described as ironclad, although police never reported to the media what exactly that was. So, despite multiple rounds of questioning, no one was ever arrested. A third theory to gain traction came from a place no one expected, and that was an anonymous letter sent to the state attorney A.V. Smith a week after Elfrida's death. The letter claimed that the writer was a self-described friend of Elfrida who had hypnotized her. According to the letter writer, he had used his mental influence to convince her to do this in order for her to get rid of her obsessive love for Charles. To some people, this sounded ridiculous, and yet some psychologists at the time didn't completely dismiss it. They pointed to Elfrida's deeply spiritual language, her emotionally intense behavior, and her susceptibility to suggestion. They theorized that maybe she had fallen under someone's influence and acted out this bizarre ritual because she had been psychologically manipulated. But even if we give this theory any credence, it doesn't explain the blow to the head, the electrocution, the locked doors, or the bloodstains. But despite all the questions and evidence to the contrary, the Lake County coroner's jury eventually ruled that Elfrida had died from burns that appeared to be self-inflicted. They couldn't definitively say that she did, nor could they explain any of the physical evidence at the scene, but they didn't charge anyone and they didn't call it murder. The investigation in many ways was messy from the start. Detectives followed dozens of leads, all of which led nowhere. They even received 2 separate confessions from 2 different men, and both of them turned out to be false. The strangest came from a man in Texas who claimed he'd done this to Elfrida himself. When authorities looked into it though, they found that he was an escaped psychiatric patient who had been locked up on the night of the incident. This was almost the final piece of evidence, but nearly a year later, in a bizarre twist of fate, Charles and his son were arrested on robbery charges. This gave new life to the theory that Charles had more secrets than he'd let on. The man who was once known as the Village Adonis was now facing criminal charges, and he was dismissed from the police force. This was enough to get people talking about Elfrida's case once again, and that maybe she had been right in her final words. Maybe the they she referred to were Charles and his son. Around this same time, Lake Bluff's new police chief, Eugene Spade, told reporters that he had additional clues that strongly pointed toward the theory that Elfrida was murdered. Whatever those clues were, however, were never detailed and they never led to an arrest. Charles refused to talk and stuck to his initial story of being in bed with a broken leg. And that was the end of it. In almost 100 years since Elfrida was found in the Lake Bluff City Hall furnace room, there have been no further developments in the case. So taken all together, we have a series of strange, horrific, and seemingly contradictory pieces of evidence. Elfrida first maintained that she was the one who had done it all, but later said that she hadn't in her admission to Charles. And then she even went a step further and said that they had done it in her final moments, but didn't clarify who they were. Then there's also the physical evidence of the damage sustained by her, which on the surface was already beyond words. All 4 limbs and her face suffered severe burns, which may have already been enough to kill her. But upon autopsy, it was clear she also suffered a massive blow to the head and was likely electrocuted. With all of the injuries and how severe they were, it's hard to imagine how they could have been self-inflicted. So that begs the question, if it wasn't her, who could have done it then? Unfortunately, maybe the only real suspect is a man who really did have a good alibi at the time, which was his broken leg. It's again hard to imagine how someone in his condition could manage all that was done to her while also keeping her quiet and moving her from place to place. With that said, given his later criminal charges, it does certainly change the perception of him, at least from the outside. But at the same time, there is still a massive gap between robbery and what happened to Elfrida. So what do you think happened? Was her first story actually the truth? Was Elfrida entirely responsible on her own? Or was someone else involved? If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.